Relax, man. My name's Jim, and I'm an alcoholic. I'm grateful for this program and enthusiastic about this way of life. I appreciate the committee asking me to be here. I found out after I got here that I'd been here before. That's the story of my life. It's, always winding up somewhere where I'd already been. Usually, some of the places I've been, I used to get stares and oh my God looks, and I didn't get that when I got here, so things must have turned out all right. By the grace of God and you people and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I hadn't found it necessary to take a drink or any mood-altering drugs since October the 30th, 1981. I've been sober 16 years in one day. I was feeling a little good about myself yesterday, with this little milestone. Talked to my sponsor yesterday morning, and he told me that the 17th year was the toughest. I wish I could tell you that I'm standing up here today because I was raised in an alcoholic family, or that I was a little maladjusted to life, or I was unable to, I had floating anxiety problems, or that I was just a little victim of my own life. And but none of those things are true. I'm standing up here today because I have a disease called alcoholism. That once I'll take a drink, I'll compromise every value, principle, and standard I have in my life. I'll use, abuse, and take advantage of everybody and everything so I can continue to drink until I get to a point of I'm knocked out, passed out, or locked out. And I didn't start off there. I started off with this big hole in my gut, and the wind blew through it all the time, and the edges were raw. And the only way that I could fill that up early in my life was to always get over there, or to get that. I don't know if you know what I mean by that, but I always felt like if I could just get over there, if I could just get what that guy had, if I could just get what they had. So I would snatch, grab, manipulate, con, steal, cheat, lie, do whatever I had to do to get over there. And then once I got over there, I didn't like it, or it wasn't the right kind. So I'd snatch, grab, manipulate, con, steal, cheat, and lie so I could get over here. And once I got over here, or I acquired this, then it wasn't the right kind, or I didn't like it, or it wasn't what it looked like when I was standing over here looking at that. So I'd snatch, grab, manipulate, con, steal, cheat, lie, do whatever I had to do to get back over here. And if you did that like I did, then you began to forge the instrument that would one day kill you, and that was your selfishness and self-centeredness. And that's what I forged. And I used that continuously for the next 13 years of my life. I hear a lot of stuff today about dysfunctional families, and I didn't come from a dysfunctional family. I came from a dysfunctional neighborhood. Everybody in my neighborhood did everything that society said you wasn't supposed to do, so I never thought there was anything wrong with it. People would bring out a bottle. People would start slapping, hitting on each other, throwing people through windows, and running up and down the neighborhood, and I thought everything was all right until I went to spend the night with a friend of mine, about 10 or 11 years old, and they brought out a bottle, and they didn't start to slapping and hitting and kicking and yelling and throwing up and passing out and those type things, and I thought, man, these folks are really strange. By the grace of God in this program, my mother's been sober in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous for 26 years. For a long time. And I tell that, and I don't tell that for any other reason than to tell you for a long, long time I made the disease of alcoholism a moral issue. I went around a long, long time and was able to blame her for my disease and make her feel guilty for all the things that were happening to me. I'm grateful today for the program of Al-Anon, or your terminology of what it is. I don't. But if it hadn't been for Al-Anon, I wouldn't be standing up here today, because I firmly believe that my mother was sober 10 years before my brother and I forced her into the program of Al-Anon. And then ththose beady-eyed, black-belt Al-Anons got a hold of her. and got her to learn the mottos of, if he dies, he dies, and so what if it's my fault, and those type things. But eventually it brought her to a point of making me be responsible for me, making me reach over and pick up the pieces of my life, making me accept that I had a disease, no matter whose fault I thought it was. I experienced my first drink at the age of 12. I experienced my first drunk at the age of 12. I had no control over the amount I took in once I took it in. Charlie said last night he was a stage 3 alcoholic from the very beginning. Well, I guess I was too. I always felt incomplete unless I got knocked out, passed out, or locked out, or threw up on somebody, or if I woke up the next morning and said, what did we do? If those things were accomplished, then I knew we had a successful night. At the age of 12, I did not turn into a daily drinker, but I did turn into a daily obsessed drinker. You know, I was obsessed with what we was going to do, when we was going to do it, where we was going to do it on the weekends. Any of the goals and dreams and admirations I began to compromise them because I found my shortcut. Because alcohol went down inside of me and it filled up that hole in my gut, and it made everything all right. And I got there. And if you're an alcoholic, you know where there is. For the next 13 years, I tried to recapture there. And I'd get almost there, and then I'd say a couple of more get me there, and I'd wind up over yonder. I never could recapture there. And I used every combination imaginable of man to recapture there. And I don't believe in talking about drugs from the podium of Alcoholics Anonymous. But being a young person in Alcoholics Anonymous, it's part of my story. You know, so I used every combination there was. And that's all I'm going to say about that. I was from a small town in Alabama. I guess Alabama's small, but I guess you're just amazed we don't have tails. But I was from a small town in Alabama, and some of the greatest enablers that I ever had were my grandparents. My grandfather he loved me no matter what. But once I started to drink, you know, I had no control. And treatment for the disease of alcoholism with my grandfather, up to the point that he died, was a haircut and a glass of milk. He'd pick me up after I got drunk. He'd take me to the barbershop in Coleman. He'd get all my hair cut off. He'd take me back to home and pour me a glass of milk and tell me not to do it anymore. I still have a complex about going to the barbershop today. My grandfather, and of course he was one of my greatest enablers, felt like that at the age of 14 I was hanging around the bad crowd. You know, it was never my fault. It was always that bad crowd's fault, them other people's fault. His wonderful grandson could never do those things unless somebody manipulated him into it. So he began to try to make arrangements for me to get away from that bad crowd. Now, he made arrangements for me to go to high school in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. Now, I don't know if you have anybody having a problem with alcohol and drugs that's about 14, 15 years old, but I suggest strongly not to send them to Fort Walton Beach, Florida. It's a guff town. It's on the beach. There's tourists 12 months out of the year. And one of the main objectives of going to the beach is to drink. And I did that religiously. I made it through high school by the skin of my teeth and wound back up in Coleman, Alabama with an attitude. And this attitude of ego or self-centeredness, ego is a nice word for self-centeredness for those that don't understand. But my ego and my self-centeredness told me that I was a leader. Much like Bill W. talks about in his story, I was a leader. You know, I needed a position in life. You know, I wanted a position. You know, I was the greatest person you had ever seen. I was the most dependent, independent person you had ever seen in your life. And what I mean by that is, don't tell me how to live my life. Can I live with you? Don't tell me how to spend my money, but can you let me borrow 25? my grandfather felt like I needed a job, and I felt like I needed a position, and because I was living with him, he got me a job working at the local hospital in housekeeping. Now, by then, you guys, all my hopes and my dreams and admirations had become secondary because I still had my shortcut. All the things I wanted to achieve were being pushed further and further down. But with this surviving alcoholic, the best way to do is over-exaggerate everything 100 times greater than what it is. I have the greatest ability of doing that. You know, I have the disability of being able to think and talk at the same time. That's why I can't listen. Well, my grandfather got me a job in housekeeping, which was way below my station in life, let me tell you that. I was ashamed of that job. I was ashamed of what it meant. I was ashamed it was way below my ego. You know, here I am, the one that needs to be running, at least be an assistant administrator of the hospital, in housekeeping. Well, by the grace of God and God's infinite ways, he changed the job from housekeeping to environmental services. And I had a tag that said, Jim Counts Environmental Services. And people asked me what I did. And I told them I checked the air in surgery to make sure no bacteria got loose. That I had a real important job. And by this time in my drinking, the only place that I found any kind of success whatsoever was oblivion. And what I mean by oblivion is usually passed out on the couch. Well, a lot of the people I hung out with, when you passed out on the couch at their place, you wound up with no shoes and no billfold. A lot of times no shirt, no jacket, those type things. These were real high-quality folks that I used to hang around with. And they are below the class of fair-weathered friends, let me just tell you that. And so I learned early on through my survival instincts that I didn't need to pass out at other people's house. So I told this guy, I'm telling you my first experience of going to jail. I told this guy that I had just got called. This is before they had beepers. And I just got called, and they needed me at surgery to check the air. And I had to be there now. So this innocent victim that I manipulated into taking me to surgery jumped out in his hot rod, and we went across the county at a high rate of speed, him thinking that he was helping somebody's life be saved so that I could check the air. And eventually every cop within the county began to chase us. And finally they roadblocked us, and he jumped out of the car telling them that I needed to be in surgery. I jumped out of the car trying to shut him up and tell him, and we both went to jail. That was my first experience in jail. And of course, once again, my grandfather came down and got me, took me out of jail, took me to the barbershop, got me a haircut, took me home, gave me a glass of milk, and this innocent victim wound up paying the price with at that time, you know, you could reckless driving and those times. There weren't a lot of DUI laws back then. And the reason I tell you that is that I had the ability to manipulate people into my disease and make them suffer the consequences of what I did. What I did. You know, and it took me a long, long time and the grace of being able to work these steps to find out that I wasn't the victim, that I captured and took hostage people in my disease. You know, I was a great hostage taker. You know, I didn't have relationships. You know, I kidnapped folks for a long time without ransom. Needless to say, when you're in a small county in Alabama, once the police know that you're trouble, and it seemed like with me that I could be laying in the back seat of the car heading west, and the police could be heading east, and they would know that I was in the back seat of the car and turn around and arrest me and take me to jail. And by the time I made it to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I'd been arrested 26 times. I had 6 felony convictions. And I finally came in front of the judge. And the judge, man, is catching this. I finally came in front of the judge. And the judge gave me 3 options. He said, Jim, you can serve a year and a day, you can join the military services, or you can leave Coleman County never to return. The first option was not viable to me. I did not want to go to jail for a year and a day. I didn't like the second option of joining the military services. And I didn't have anywhere to go on the third option. My grandfather felt like the best option was for me to join the military services, so he took me down to all the recruiters, and the recruiters studied me for a little while, and they took looks at me and checked me out, and they wouldn't take me in the military during wartime too. I was an undesirable. So I left Coleman County, never to return. I returned today. My grandmother's still living. I go straight to the nursing home that she lives in, get back on the interstate, and get straight back on the interstate and head back home. And the reason I tell you that is because when we get down to making amends, it's step 8 and 9. It's not step 89. Okay? It's steps 8 and 9. I got to have the willingness before I can make the direct amend. And I talk to a lot of the guys I sponsor, and they want to jump out right quick and sorry over people and sorry here and sorry there until people say, damn right you're sorry, and that's all you're ever going to be. And that's what people said to me. I drank in a community. I did crime in a community. I got sober in another community. And the community that I drank of only know Jim Counts, the drunk, the criminal. And I can't expect them to know me any differently, other than what I do today by putting one foot in front of the other one and being a responsible citizen. If I tell my grandmother I'm going to be there at 10 o'clock on Saturday, I'm there at 10 o'clock on Saturday. I firmly believe that you have to ask God for the willingness before you get out and start making direct amends. My job in amends is to repair and rebuild and to restore. And I have to ask God how I'm supposed to do that. I didn't mean to get off on that, but that's part of it. Well, I wound up in Birmingham, Alabama, where I live pretty much today. I live on the outskirts of Birmingham in Pelham. But wound up in Birmingham, Alabama, wound up going to school, wound up getting my paramedic license. First thing I need to do, if you have any relatives whatsoever living in the Birmingham area back during the late 60s and early 70s that I might have happened to pick up on the ambulance, let me make amends to you right now. They used to wonder why the patient was sitting in the front seat of the ambulance. That wasn't the patient. That was me with an oxygen mask on, trying to sober up enough to make it to the next call. There was an example that I was telling somebody last night that it had been raining and this lady was having chest pains, and we went to pick her up, and I went to get up into the back of the ambulance with the stretcher, and my foot slipped off the back bumper, and I fell and cut my chin on the bottom of the bumper. And by the time we got to the hospital, she had to help me out of the back of the ambulance to get me in the hospital so I could get my chin sewed up. And I tell people a lot of these stories, and they're real funny today. And I'm grateful by the grace of God that something seriously didn't happen. I firmly believe that God looks out for fools and drunks long before we're aware of His presence in our life. And I know that He went before me a long, long time because I worked that job for about 6 years. And I worked it in blackouts, and I worked shifts I don't remember working. And I'm grateful that God went before me and something seriously didn't happen. Needless to say that I lost that job after a point in time. Pretty much at this point wound up on the streets. My mother had been sober now probably 8 or 9 years. She had started this big book crap and this AA stuff with all you old folks sitting around talking about what it used to be like and how miserable you were, and going to those meetings every night of the week, because if you didn't go to those meetings every night of the week, you were going to dash out of the room and get drunk. Now, my mother had started mentioning to me that I possibly might be an alcoholic, which I was not, of course, because I partied. There's a difference between my image of an alcoholic at that point was somebody who went to the living room, turned on the console stereo, with that little red light on that console stereo. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. They had a little red light, and you'd listen to Eddie Arnold sing Little Green Apples, and you drank Early Times whiskey with the lights turned off. That was my mother. That's an alcoholic. I partied. I went out, like most social drinkers do. I went to jail. I wrecked cars. You know, I got in fights. I got robbed. I was robbed. I did rob. Did all the fun things that most party people do. And I was not like my mother. Well, as I said earlier, my mother, I was able to manipulate my mother into guilt. Able to make her think, it's all your fault that I am like I am, because if you had been there and if you had done the things that you were supposed to do, we wouldn't be doing these things. And we were able to manipulate her, my brother and I, for a long, long time. The only problem I had with that was I didn't have a job, and as I said, with my disease, I'd do anything that I necessarily had to do to drink. So I wrote bad checks on my mother. My mother gave me the opportunity to find treatment or the county jail. She said, you can either go to Caredale, which is the treatment program, or the county jail. So I chose Caredale. I went to treatment, and as I said earlier, I had the ability to con my way through a lot of things. And my mother had started sponsoring people, and they'd stayed around the house a lot, and I heard all the big book stuff, and, just enough to be dangerous. And I went down to this treatment program, and I was down there for about 15 days, and when I was talking the talk, know nothing about walking the walk, and they made me a counselor. And this was years and years and years ago. And I was counseling people. And I was driving everybody to Atlanta, and I had never been to Atlanta myself. And then what I mean by that, I was telling everybody how to get sober, and I'd never been there myself. I had all the directions, but I hadn't walked the walk. I hadn't walked the path. So I didn't actually know if those directions actually worked. And that's the one thing I say to newcomers today. Don't listen to what I say or anybody else says in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Pick up this big book. Read the directions, follow the plan, and then you'll know if it works. You don't have to listen to anybody. Follow the directions that are laid out in the book. What do you got to lose anyway? Well, God has this weird way of working things out. And it's called alcoholism. And it's called untreated alcoholism. And the obsession to drink returned. And the obsession to drink returned with this alcoholic of the question, am I or ain't I? And the answer came back, no, you're not. I need to be a little bit more honest about that. I was still smoking marijuana, having one spiritual experience after another. So the answer came back, no, I'm not. So I went down to the local 7-Eleven and got a 6-pack of beer with some other folks. And we drove around and drank that 6-pack of beer. After we finished that 6-pack of beer, I didn't rip my clothes off, start urinating on the furniture, or howling at the moon, or doing any of those weird things that I did when I actually really drank alcoholically. I just went back home, went back to the treatment facility, started counseling, doing what most social drinkers do. The thing that happened, though, and started putting the pieces together, the obsession to do it again came back. I couldn't wait till we went out for the second test. I couldn't wait till the next weekend. I couldn't wait to get that next drink. I couldn't wait. That drive. And if you're an alcoholic, you know what that drive is. I got to get that next one. So the next weekend came by, and I walked down to the local 7-Eleven at this point, and went inside and got me a case of the taste, and paid for it, and put it under my arm, and like most social drinkers, I ran across the street and jumped down in the culvert that was across the street there to drink my case of beer socially. And the next thing I remember, I was in Shreveport, Louisiana. This started off in Sylacauga, Alabama, which is about 40 miles outside of Birmingham. And the next thing I remember, I was in Shreveport, Louisiana, headed for Dallas, Texas, to get rich. I was always going somewhere to get rich so I could come back and show everybody. Did y'all do that? I did. I was always going, I will show them. That helped me to justify stealing from you. See, if I stole $20 from you, I'm going to put $40 back once I get rich. So that you will be real proud of me. Well, we wound up in Shreveport, Louisiana, me and another guy who I did not know, in somebody's car that did not belong to him or me, and we were selling parts off of it going to Dallas. Now, he had an uncle who had a friend who had a brother that worked in the oil fields that we were going to get a first-rate job paying us a whole lot of money an hour. We wound up in Dallas on the streets in the missions doing day labor because we couldn't find the uncles whose friend's brother had the job for us. So we wound up in the street in Dallas doing day labor out in Dallas. And let me tell you something. I'm an old homeboy. I don't get out, and what that means is I don't get out of a 50-mile radius of my enablers, of the people who I can manipulate to take responsibility for my disease. And Dallas, Texas is outside that 50-mile radius of Birmingham, Alabama. So I wound up pretty much on the streets out there, and I thought by this time, you guys, I was much like Charlie. I was a crying drunk. I was a sick drunk. I was one of the kind of drunks that, with the real drunks on the street, I repulsed them. I was sitting in a warehouse one night, and we were drinking wine, and I started getting sick, started crying, wanting to go home, and getting homesick, and this old guy that had been on the streets for about 30 years came up and said, "Man, you need to get away from us. You're down here to punish yourself. We're down here out of choice. Get away from us." I really felt like a failure at that point. I couldn't even drink with the street drunks. I couldn't function on the streets. So at that point, I started walking home from Dallas, back to Birmingham. I wound up going into the DTs somewhere on the interstate. A buddy that was with me wound up finding a liquor store and getting me something to drink and knocking the DTs off. And I decided at that point that I would never drink again. Never drink again. Now, I wasn't an alcoholic, but I would never drink again. That's what goes to believe that abstinence is not a cure. Abstinence is just a beginning. Because I was convinced that I would never drink again. I hitchhiked on back into Birmingham and was right outside Birmingham, and this little girl pulled over to pick me up, and she was going to take me back on into town, and she says she had to make one stop. And she pulled in the front of this grocery store and came out of that grocery store, and she had a case of beer that had coal beads dripping down the side of it about that big around. And still today, I don't remember drinking that first half of beer. I remember looking down, and the beer was open, and I had drinking half of it. So I decided, and I went on about another 6-month drunk. I wound back up in Cullman, and not an alcoholic, but I'm going to read all these books. So I started reading, I'm okay, you're okay, it's okay, they're okay, we're okay, everything's okay, erroneous zones, improving your attitude. And I had one of the best attitudes you had ever seen passed out in the front yard at my grandparents'. I had a wonderful attitude, but I didn't do anything about my alcoholism. Because I didn't know what the problem was. So I decided anybody who kept going through the things like I kept going through had to be crazy. So I went down to the local mental institution called Bryce Hospital, and told them I wanted to check myself in, that I was crazy, psychotic. And they put me in this big old long room. And I had a foreign doctor at one end of the table, and I was at the other end of the table, and we stared and looked at each other for about 35 minutes. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and he wrote on paper, and I wrote on paper, and we stared at each other, and he finally looked up, and he says, "No, Jim, I don't think you crazy. I think you alcoholic." And I said, No, I'm crazy. He said, "No, Jim, you alcoholic." I said, No, I'm crazy. We batted this back and forth for about 30, 45 minutes until finally I pissed him off, and he says, "Okay, Jim, you want crazy, I give you crazy." So he locked me up in one of the back wards at Bryce Hospital. I was on the ward for about 15 minutes until I was running up and down the hall saying, "I'm alcoholic, I'm alcoholic." I made him so mad that he left me on there 15 days. I was sitting next to this guy one morning, and kind of normal looking guy. I said, "Hey man, what you in here for?" He said, "I'm having my teeth fixed." I said, that's great. I said, "What's your name?" He said, "Chris." I said, "What? Chris what?" He said, "Chris Kringle." Most people know me as Santa Claus. I said, "I got to get out of here." Finally, I manipulated my way off that unit and got on the A&D unit. And I was miserable, you guys. I mean, I was miserable. They'd let us out for an hour a day to do recreation stuff. I dumped all their equipment. They had equipment in this recreation bag. I dumped all their equipment out of the recreation bag and stuck my personal clothes in there and threw a softball up against the back fence and then jumped the fence at Bryce Hospital and escaped and went over into the fraternity houses and got drunk. Yes, I'm an escapee from a mental institution. Let me finish that story and be real honest about it. I had the opportunity to go back right before that unit closed down in our state, probably 10 years ago now. And I went back to make amends. And I went to the directors of that place and I said, "I'm really sorry for how I left here and what I did and how I did it." And they said, "Jim, we were trying to figure out a way to ask you to leave anyway. You could have just walked out the front door." But that's the story of my life. I got to dive through the window when the door's open. I got to come in with gun blazing. I got to have the thing where, everybody knows it's me. I'd walk in and people wouldn't even be wanting to fight, and they'd raise their eyebrow, and I'd start yelling. That's called guilt. It's called building your excuse system. Being able to rationalize my behavior. Well, I got out of Bryce, and by this time, you guys, I'd been in treatment probably 12 times. And I don't say that as bragging. I say that as, treatment's job is to pick somebody up and to dust them off and to pour them to Alcoholics Anonymous. And every treatment program that I went into, they picked me up, they dusted me off, and they ported me to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was too terminally unique to go to Alcoholics Anonymous. I was different. I did great in treatment. I was one of the best treatment folks you ever see. I could cry on cue. I could sit in those groups. I could do backflips when you wanted me to. I could write them stories. Man, I did great stories. I did excellent stories. I never did an inventory, but I did great stories. Looked good for Dale books. Jumped across alligator heads, trying to get a drink, stuff like that. Man, it looked good. Didn't do nothing about changing me. I wound up in treatment, and I wound up trying to manipulate my mother. And as I said earlier, I firmly believe that my disease forced my mother into Al-Anon. She'd been in Al-Anon for 16 years now. She goes to 2 AA meetings a week and 2 Al-Anon meetings a week. And I've been sober 16 years, so you know how bad that is. But them little black belt Al-Anons with the little beady eyes got a hold of her, and if he dies, he dies. And see, I used to be able to call my mother up, and, Mother, I need to come back home and live. No, you can't come back home and live. I'd start crying. It's all your fault. Either send me money or let me come back home, blah, blah, blah. Give her all the story. Making a moral issue out of this thing. She'd let me come back. She'd send me money. Well, them damn Al-Anons got a hold of her, the black belt ones. And I called her up one day and I said, Mother, it's all your fault that I'm like I am. Big Paws came on the phone. She said, Jim, goddamn right it's my fault. Now what are you going to do about it? Hung up the phone. I said, shit, what am I going to do? Well, I wound back up in Coleman, and the very man that supported me whether I was drunk or sober, he let me come back to his house and live. And, I had this thing called pride. I couldn't ask for it anymore. I'd been through treatment as many times as I had. I'd given every opportunity. I'd heard the stories about having great potential. I was going to unleash it one day, potential, I was going to unleash. Just stand back, because this potential could be dangerous. And my grandfather, but I firmly believe that pride kills more alcoholics than anything else. Because we can't ask for it anymore. We can't accept it anymore. We can't reach outside of ourselves and say it's different anymore. We can't say, I can't. We can't say that, will you help me? And that's where I was at. And I wrote 4 bad checks on my grandfather. And I firmly believe today, you guys, if my grandfather, when I walked in his house that day when those checks came back and he had them in his hands, and if he would have slapped me, kicked me, stabbed me, called me every kind of name in the world, I would have been able to justify it and rationalize it. But he had those 4 checks in his hand when I came walking through the door, and he looked at me and he said, all you would have had to do was ask. All you would have had to do was ask. I turned around and walked out, and for the last 2 years of my addiction, I lived on the streets. And I'll leave it to your imagination what those last 2 years were like. Any dreams, any hopes, any admirations I had, any principles, any values, I compromised them. And I wound up in the park downtown one day, and some people had come and asked me about my brother that was here before. And he's drinking today. And the reason I tell you that is that I hear a lot of stuff today about earth people, and a lot of stuff about normies, and a lot of stuff about alkies, and a lot of stuff about druggies. And it really scares me that people have that kind of attitude, because it's my job to listen to the message and not judge the messenger. Because there's been a lot of earth people that have given me a lot of good messages. And there's been a lot of good alkies, and there's been a lot of good druggies. And there's been a lot of good Al-Anons that have given me some good messages. And I'm grateful to God that my sponsor in this program have given me the opportunity to listen to the message rather than judge the messenger. But I was down at the park and went over to the bus station to panhandle some money, and my brother was in there, and he was just being discharged from a program, and he was screwed up, and he looked at me and he said, Jim, you need to give it one more shot. He said, you're going to die, and you ought to give it one more shot. So I picked up the phone and I called a friend of mine and went through treatment, detox again, not to surprise anybody, and wound up at a halfway house. Long-term alligator farm. I don't know if you know what that means, but An alligator farm is for the rough of the roughest. You know, it's where they tell you to drink about 42 times a day if you want to, and really puts you in the hardcore, probably like OAA. I mean, you do a lot of work, you do a lot of stuff, you do a lot of meetings, and you work a lot in the big book, and back then it was a lot of confrontation. As Charlie said last night, you can't confront anymore. You can't do those things anymore. We still do it at the fellowship house, let me tell you. But I wound up at the fellowship house. I wound up over there, and I was miserable. But I'm grateful to God today that there's a bunch of old-timers around there. Because the first day I got there, the first thing they put me on was cleaning up the Jaffe Bar. And I don't know if you know what that is, but that's the local club around Birmingham, in Birmingham area, the 24-hour club. And they made me go up there and empty down ashtrays, and empty down coffee cups, and mop down floors with a bunch of you damn old-timers, that told me about spilling more on your shoes, and if you want to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, you need to plant your ass in a chair, and, doing all those type of things. And I was miserable. And I'd go up there every day, and I'd mop the floors, and I'd empty the ashtrays, and I would, until finally, the old mind says, them old-timers got something. You don't have to work these steps. Now, what you need to do is when they pray every afternoon after these meetings, you need to grab a couple of those guys' arms. They got 15, 16, 17 years of sobriety, maybe a spiritual experience to run down their arm. So I'd grab a hold of the old-timers' hands, man, and ride, hoping something would, But, the reason I tell that is because I always wanted a shortcut, see? I want a shortcut. I'm grateful to God that you people told me, if you want what we got, then you're going to have to take the action necessary to get it. Because I firmly believe today, if I would have walked in here and you would have gave me 5 years of sobriety, I would have used, abused, and took advantage of it, tossed it to the side, and said, hey, you didn't give me the right kind. You gave me your first 5 years of sobriety. I wanted your second 5 years. I'm grateful today that people said, if you want what we got, we will support you to get it, but you must take the action necessary to get it. One of my favorite pamphlets in Alcoholics Anonymous is A Member's Eye View of AA. And if you're new in the program, I strongly recommend that you read that pamphlet. It's one of the best pamphlets ever written. And if you don't get resentful after you read that pamphlet, and if you don't get up and start taking some action, or it doesn't force you to start reading a big book, then you need to read that pamphlet again. And keep reading it until you get resentful enough to start working the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because that's what it put me in. But I was cleaning up them coffee bars, and I was running back and forth, and I was doing everything that was necessary to do, and I was trying to feel my way to recovery. I firmly believe you cannot feel your way to recovery. You have got to act your way into sobriety. But I was miserable. And if you're a newcomer in here, I know exactly how you feel, because I'd come in here and sit in them chairs, and I'd have to grab a hold of the sides of them, and I'd ride them suckers for an hour, and I'd vibrate, and then I'd let go, and it'd shoot me out, and I'd run out of the room, and I'd run back to the halfway house. Then I'd go back to the meeting, I'd ride it for an hour and vibrate, and just know if I let go of this sucker, I'm going to flip out, fall right in the floor, start flopping around and all this kind of stuff, and that's the way it was. After I was about 4.5 months without a drink and going up to the coffee bar and doing the things that was necessary to do, and except getting a sponsor and a home group and those type things, I got back to the house one night and I knew I was going to drink again. I knew it was coming. And I got back up in my room and I started loading up my bags, and something I heard an old-timer say was to get down on my knees and ask God to keep me sober. And I got down on the side of my bed, and I said, God, I just don't want to drink and drug it. I just don't care anymore. And I'm willing to do whatever is necessary to do. And for the first time in 4.5 months, I was able to get up in that bed and go to sleep. And the next morning when I woke up, I wasn't able to levitate furniture or turn rock into bread like I can do today. There will be a small altar call after this meeting for those who do want me to lay hands. But I was able to listen. I was able to hear. I was able to ask somebody to help me. I was able to find a sponsor. And I got a sponsor that was the meanest SOB you could ever imagine, that was from Pittsburgh, that lived on the streets in Pittsburgh. He prefaced everything with mother, and he told me to drink more often than he told me to stay sober. Jim, I don't want to work those steps. Well, go drink. Well, I don't want to drink. Then work the steps. Well, I don't want to work that step. Well, go drink. He said, when are you going to realize that there's no middle-of-the-road solution for people like me and you? You either work the steps or you drink. You know, the one thing you got today that you've never had before is a choice. You can choose on a daily basis whether to work the steps or drink. 4.5 months ago, you didn't have that choice. It wasn't a choice to get up in the morning and drink a little Renedian wine and sit in the backyard. It was to madly wake up and search for $1.42 to find me some Thunderbird. You know, my sponsor did lots more than helping me or guiding me through sobriety. My sponsor taught me how to be a person. He taught me how to be a father. He taught me how to be a worker. He taught me how to be a helper. He taught me how to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. He told me that to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, that you got to work the steps in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that we'll more than happy let you stay as a guest in Alcoholics Anonymous if you want to. And don't get me wrong, you guys, that I believe the fellowship is vitally important in Alcoholics Anonymous. I wouldn't be here today. But if I wanted to become a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, that I had to start working the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I had to start showing people that sobriety meant something to me. That I never could lose sight that sobriety was something that I need to be grateful for on a daily basis. And that I had to be at the doorways, just like I saw these guys at the doorways today at my home group, with my hand out and a smile on my face, telling people when they walked through the door that it was good to see them. And being able to show that, I am grateful that it's not necessary for me to drink on a daily basis. And it's not necessary for me to compromise my dignity and self-respect. Because sobriety to me, a day at a time, is recapturing my dignity and self-respect just a little bit more than I did the day before. That's what sobriety is. Is to be able to look in the mirror every morning and not have this overwhelming desire to throw up or to cut my throat. That's what sobriety is. But if I wanted to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, then I better start working some steps. And I said, well, buddy, I've been working the steps. And he said, well, show me where you've been working the steps out of the big book. And I flipped this baby over to How It Works. And he looked at me and he looked at eye to eye and he says, it's important to know why the jackass is getting in the ditch before you start trying to get him out. And I said, what do you mean by that? He says, you're looking in the middle of the book. He said, what the hell are you going to do in the middle of the book? You're trying to come up with a solution before you know what the problem is. If you want to know what the problem is, you got to go back to the doctor's opinion. So I started reading the doctor's opinion, and man, the light came on. I found out finally why I drank. And you know why I drank? Because I liked the effects produced by alcohol. There's a paragraph in the doctor's opinion that says men and women drank essentially because they liked the effects produced by alcohol. And all them reasons that I'd been using for 13 years of my life were no good anymore. I like the effects produced by alcohol. That's why I drank. Damn. You know, that was simple. Well, we got to step 2. Oh my gosh. Don't want to piss the old timers off. We got to step 2, and I said, you know, I'm a good Baptist. I understand this stuff. And he said, that don't have nothing to do about religion. I said, I used to go to Baptist church every time I was in trouble. And within the first 15 minutes, I was already named a sinner 43 times. And he said, it don't have nothing to do with religion. I said, oh, you're not fooling me with that crap. I said, I know it's got something to do with religion. He says, now let's look at it this way. How about what did you do when the police looked for you? I said, I hid out. He said, well, what did they do? I said, well, they suspected that I did something. He said, well, what did they do after that? I said, usually they investigated. He said, then what happened? I said, usually they came and arrested me. He said, oh, well, okay, let's do it the same way. He said, why don't you take the smallest bit of suspicion that this program might work for you? You investigate it by taking action in it. And you get the results from it. If you lay that stupid head of yours on the pillow tonight and you don't take a drink, then it's working. And for the last 16 years and 1 day of my life, I've been taking the smallest bit of suspicion that this program might work for me, investigating it throughout the day by interacting with you guys and trying to apply these principles in my life. And each night that I've laid my head down on the pillow, I hadn't found it necessary to take a drink or a drug. So it's working. That's all it is to it. Damn. Got to the part about making a decision. And he said, you know, the only thing you need to worry about there is that you got a choice. You got a choice each day of your life. You make a decision based on choice. Do I want to go back to this way, or do I want to go this way? And each morning when I get on my knees, I say, God, help me stay sober and clean. That's the choice I make. You know, God, you direct my thinking and my actions. And that's our will in our lives. It's our thinking and our actions. My will is my thinking, and my life is my actions. And I make a decision each morning on my knees. You know, it surprises me today that now all my guys I sponsor have to get on their knees, whether they get on their knees with me or without me. But, you know, I don't know why you don't get on your knees. You know, for me, and this is just alcoholic, for me to humble myself before God, it keeps me from trying to figure things out my own. Because I'll get standing up, and it's not long till we're eye to eye, and then below, after that, I'm a little bit step above. So I have to get down on my knees. And I used to do it at that halfway house. But what I did, you know, pride still takes over a lot, you guys. And I'd throw my shoes farther up under the bed, you know, and then get down there and keep me somewhere clean and grab my shoes up real quick, you know, and put them on. And, you know, the funny thing is I still do that today. Eventually I started locking myself in the bathroom there and then doing it. And then still today I lock myself in the bathroom and do it. You know, my kids, oh, Daddy's praying, you know. Oh, you're praying, Daddy? I need to comb my hair. You know, I did my inventory, and I did the inventory I was outlining in the big book. Now, I did a lot of these adventure stories for these treatment programs. I told them 10% of the truth, and they locked me up for extra 30 days most of the time. So I did this inventory, and I listed down, I'm resentful at, I'm fearful of, I harmed others in relationships by. And I put it all down on paper, had about 3 pages. My sponsor told me, which I couldn't do, he said, just name 4 things that you swore that you would never tell anybody, even under great torture of death. And you've done a complete inventory. I didn't do that, but I listed everything. So I walked in there and I said, now he's going to feel sorry for me. And I took it in there and we sat down to do a 5th step and I started naming this stuff out. And he took each and every one of those damn situations and turned them back on me. And showed me how I had self-centered expectations. How I'd always wanted other people to treat me as the victim. and how I'd always place more people in responsibility for things they wasn't responsible for, and how I always wanted to be responsible for things that I wasn't responsible for. But the one thing, and as it says in the Members' Eye View of Alcoholics Anonymous, we both stood there stripped of all pretense and defense. He shared with me his defects of characters and his shortcomings. He shared with me his obsessions. And for once in my life, there was one person who knew everything about me and loved me anyway. And I didn't have this overwhelming spiritual experience when I walked out of that room that day. But for the first time in my life, I was able to walk out of that room and look you eye to eye. I didn't have to look down at the cracks and the crevices in the sidewalk. I didn't have to walk around ashamed, but I was able to look you in the eye and say, damn right I did it. But by the grace of God in this program, I ain't got to do it that way no more. That's what the fifth step did for me. Step 6 and 7. I do not believe it's step 67. It's step 6 and step 7. I believe God removes defects of characters on His terms and His time. But it's my job to be aware of them. It's my job to accept them. And it's my job to turn them over to God and walk over to the 7th step and start practicing a little love, tolerance, and patience. To be conscious of when I'm losing my patience. It's my job to take action in the 7th step. It's my job to release in the 6th step. And if I can be aware and accepting of the 6th step, then I can take action in the 7th step. But when I want to struggle with those defects of characters, and I want to control them, and I want to grasp them like holding sand in my hand, then I become obsessed with them. And when I become obsessed with them, this brain of mine starts locking down on them. And then I start trying to control them. I talked about the 8th step, the 9th step, and the one thing I want to tell you is this little story. I was sober about 9 months, and I was Mr. Recovery. We all know Mr. Recovery, don't we? I got the big book. I'm thumping it, I'm throwing big book quotes and throwing shit around, and impressing everybody, And, man, I still have warrants out on my arrest. Felony warrants. Knock at the door one day. Police from Coleman came and picked me up. Felony warrants. Took me to jail sober. I said, man, God, what is this, man? I am sober today. They should just forget this stuff. I am being good. Took me right on to jail. Guy told me, sober or not, buddy, you're going to jail today. And we done talked to the judge. You're going to do 15 to life. Because I was under 3-time offender. Took me to 5 jails in one day. That's how many warrants I had out on me in different places. Man, I started getting discouraged. I said, God, what is this, man? I mean, I am Mr. Recovery in Birmingham. You have got me in jail. Started feeling sorry for myself. Called my sponsor. They let me make a phone call. Called my sponsor. I said, man, what is this? He said, well, maybe God wants you to start an AA meeting in prison. I said, bullshit. I'll start an AA meeting in prison. I don't want to hear none of that stuff now. Ho, ho, ho. AA meeting in prison? No way, buddy. He said, you need to start accepting God's will. I said, hell with God. I said, this ain't going to happen. So I started feeling sorry for myself, and the guys started coming back like I was telling you. They remember Drunk Jim. They come back, look at counts. He's sober today. He's going to prison. We talked to the judge. The judge says he's going to prison. And I started getting down on myself. Man, God, what's all this about? I've been trying to get good. You guys, sobriety doesn't have anything to do with being good. Sobriety has something about getting better. I'm in the drunk tank, which that's an experience if you're sober. Let me just tell you that. I'm in the drunk tank at Coleman Jail, and a buddy of mine got put in jail that night. He slipped in there with a pint of whiskey, vodka. Slipped in there with a pint of vodka. And he asked me if I wanted to drink. I told him, no. People kept bugging me. I kept thinking about running that prison and running that meeting in the prison. And didn't want to do that, and started getting real discouraged, and decided I'd drink. I said, to hell with this, I'll drink. And I told him I'd drink, and I was 10 months sober. I told him I'd drink, and said it'd been a while since I drank, so I'll have to get me a chaser. So I called the trustee down to give me change for $1. And when he reached down in his pocket to give me change for $1, he pulled out a chip, a 90-day chip. And I said, man, you in AA? He said, yeah, been in AA 90 days. I said, I'm in AA too. He kind of looked at me kind of funny, like, and we sat there and we shared. And I knew from that point to this point today, it was never going to be necessary for me to drink ever again as long as I surrendered God's plan to God. It wasn't. I wonder what he's up to a lot, you guys. I really do. Don't get me wrong here. But it's my job to put one foot in front of the other one and do God's will in front of my life. I've gone back to that jail several times trying to find out who that guy was, and nobody can tell me who he was. They don't remember him being in there. I don't believe there's any coincidences in Alcoholics Anonymous. I believe there's a lot of spiritual experiences. It's my job, and the reason I tell you this on the 10th step, it's my job to continue to take personal inventory. I was about 10 years sober, you guys, and I got away from the basis of recovery. I had kids, and my life got out of balance, and I believe sobriety is about balance. And I got out of balance. Didn't go to many meetings, and quit reading the book. And the next thing you know, every detective character that I ever had came back. And I couldn't blame it on alcoholism. I couldn't blame it on my drinking. And I started repeating the same patterns over and over again up to the point that I almost drank. And I went back to my sponsor and did another 4-step and got back to the basics of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the basics of Alcoholics Anonymous is going to meetings and reading the big book. And being at that back door back there with my arm stuck out and with a smile on my face. And not taking recovery at an advantage or disadvantage. Because any day that I go to bed and I'm not grateful for not taking a drink, then there's something wrong with my recovery. And please, 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 never go to bed without being grateful that you hadn't taken a drink or a drug on a daily basis. I don't care what's going on in life. I don't care what your kids are doing or what your job's doing or who's not showing up or who's coming. Go to bed with the gratitude of sobriety. Because I almost drank after 10 years of sobriety. When I do my inventory every night now, the only three things I got to ask God is, was I kind? Was what I did today true? And was what I did today necessary? And if I can answer yes to those 3 things, then I can go to bed comfortably. If not, I know automatically where I got to do the next day to rebuild and restore those relationships. Is it kind? Is it true? Is it necessary? God was always out here with me, you guys. I never could get there. People I admired in life. People I appreciated in life. I never could get there. The 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous never got me there. What happened was, through working the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, God came here. I have an individual understanding and acceptance of God in my life today. That's my God. There's been a lot of things that have happened to me in recovery. There's been a lot of things that the good and the bad. That halfway house that I went and got sober at, I'm the director of it today. 147 bed alligator farm, which is an experience on a daily basis. I fight tooth and nail to keep the old principles there. And the old way of getting sober and going to meetings. And much like Charlie, today I'm winning the battle. I don't know how much longer we're going to be able to do it, but, it produces something, and that's something you can't argue about. It's like Charlie said, if you can get 100 alcoholics together to agree on writing this book, then you better hold on to it because it must have depth and weight, because we can't get 100 alcoholics to agree on anything. The hardest thing that's been in my life, you guys, is when Jim gets in the way of Jim. That's the hardest thing. About 8 years ago, I was went back up to my grandfather's, and we were standing out in the front yard, and he looked at me, and he said, Jim, I want you to know one thing. He said, this program that you're involved in has made you grow beyond my wildest expectations and dreams. And you know what? I couldn't walk away from there taking any credit for that. Because this is what God, the grace of God and you people did for me. The next day, he committed suicide. If it hadn't been for you folks, and the grace of this program, and your support, and what I knew, I never would have made it through that. Because how can you make amends to somebody when you broke their spirit? He had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and he just didn't want to do it that way. I got a lot of good stories to tell, a lot of funny stories. I'm grateful to you folks today. I'm grateful that y'all have invited me up here. I got 5 kids. I hadn't had any control of anything I did. I couldn't. I noticed that our kid load cut down after cable TV, though. They all range from the age of 13 to 8. It is never a dull moment. 2 girls and 3 boys. 13-year-olds at home right now that I'm the meanest father that any 13-year-old girl has ever had. But, they have never seen me drink. But yet they live by the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon. I didn't know that because they'd never been around it. But their mother went through some surgery for cancer, and man, they were right there. They were right there just practicing little principles, and it amazed me. So never get amazed at this program. I wish I could sit up here and tell you that I practice principles every day. Or I get up in the morning and I ask God to give me integrity. But I ask God to put me in a position to practice principles. I can't get up here and say, I practice principles. Principles to me are actions. I have to put one foot in front of the other one. I can't practice principles by words. I have to practice principles by actions. And in closing, oh my God, I want to apologize to the old-timers. That would be the first thing I'd do for talking 20 minutes over. But, if you're a newcomer in here and I hadn't said anything that you can use today, just come back to a flock of meetings. Keep coming to meetings. Take what you can use and get rid of. But the one thing I ask you to do is to take this big book and take the smallest bit of suspicion that maybe this program might work for you. Investigate it throughout the day. You get the results from it, and then you'll know if it works for you or not. Just that smallest bit of suspicion. The one thing you got to say, what do you have to lose anyway? What do you have to lose anyway? One thing that means a whole lot to me, and I say it at the end of every one of my talks, and I could have got up here and said it and sat down, but I read it on the walls, and we still have it on the walls at the fellowship house, and the guys see it every day. And it says, I used to ask God for all things so I can enjoy life. He gave me life so I can enjoy all things. Thank y'all very much.